I'd like to start by thanking Bloomberg for hosting this speech today, and thanks, Con, for that introduction. Having campaigned for 6 months in the early part of this year passionately to stay in the EU, I'm still getting used to the idea of being called the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU. But friends and colleagues, at this time of year, it's natural to reflect, to look back on the year that has passed and look forward to the year ahead. Years that are so full of significance that the year itself becomes shorthand for a set of events are rare. There are a few last century. But I think there's no doubt that 2016 will go down as one of the truly defining years of the 21st century. 2 years ago to this day, 13th of December 2014, I was in St Pancras Church opposite Euston Station. I was speaking to hundreds of Labour Party members having just been selected to succeed Frank Dobson as Labour's candidate for my home constituency of Holborn and St Pancras. Some of those members are here today, and I'm sure they remember that occasion. How different the world looked then. Is it any wonder that we're still attempting to understand the world as it has now become and how we got here? But the real challenge is not just to interpret the past, but to chart the path forwards to the future. And that is my task for today. And Connor's referred to this, but coming here to Bloomberg to deliver a speech on Britain and the European Union might be considered to be tempting fate. But when David Cameron spoke here in January 2013, he decided, as I'm afraid was so often the case, to put short-term political considerations ahead of the national interest. My speech today will be guided by a different lodestar, our country's interest. I want to talk about how Labour should respond to Brexit in the national interest. First, the context. The Labour Party campaigned to stay in the EU. I campaigned to stay in the EU. Many people in this room campaigned to stay in the EU. The vote was to leave. A high turnout, a relatively close result, but a clear result. Yes, there were half-truths and untruths in the campaign, none more egregious than the promise of £350 million a week for our NHS. That was daubed, of course, on the Vote Leave bus. Yes, the tone of the referendum was deeply divisive, with social consequences that we will all have a duty to tackle. But we had a referendum, and we have a clear result. Had it gone the other way, those of us who passionately campaigned for Remain would have expected the result to have been accepted and respected. And that cuts both ways. Now we face an uncertain future. The first step, of course, is for the Prime Minister to distill the diverse and divergent views within her own party into a model of Brexit that can be negotiated with the EU. I do understand what a difficult position the Prime Minister is in. Her predecessor, leading a government in which she served as Home Secretary, oversaw one of the greatest derelictions of duty of any British government in modern times. The decision not to undertake any preparations whatsoever for a vote to leave has left the country without a plan and the government without direction. The stakes could not be higher, and the risks of getting this wrong should not be underestimated. The Prime Minister must now embark on the most difficult and complicated negotiations this country has undertaken since the end of the Second World War. The outcome will determine not just our place in Europe, but our place in the world. And the role of the opposition is crucial. This is not business as usual. Setting out what Labour would do in 2020 at the next election does not suffice. This is real opposition in real time. By 2020, we will be living in a different world. So how should Labour approach the task? Some have argued that Labour should adopt the stance taken by the Liberal Democrats. frustrate the process, vote against the triggering Article 50, block the road and somehow turn the clock back to the 22nd of June this year. Now, insofar as those advocating this course of action fear that in exiting the EU we risk becoming isolated, abandoning our values of tolerance and damaging our economy, I understand the plea. But it's the wrong response for three reasons. First, as a matter of principle, no serious political party can claim to accept and respect the outcome of the referendum and in the next breath say that it will seek to prevent the Prime Minister from even starting the Article 50 negotiations. A short point, but an important one. Second, any political party with an ambition simply to frustrate the process cannot unify or heal the country. Since I was appointed to my current role, I've travelled all over the UK, in all regions. I've also been to Wales, Northern Ireland, Ireland and Scotland. I've met groups and individuals, held public events, talked to businesses, large and small, and discussed Brexit with different political parties and leaders. From this, the evidence is clear. As a society, we're more divided now than at any time in my life. That divide is deep, and in some instances, it's bitter. The surge in hate crime across the country and the reaction to the High Court judges who delivered judgment in the Article 50 case are testament to this. In some London constituencies, 75% of those voting in the referendum voted to remain. Yet in other areas, the precise opposite is the case. Last Friday, I was in the Midlands, where in some areas, 75% of those voting voted to leave. A new fracture has emerged in politics, and it's real. The role of any responsible government ought to be to repair the breach, to bring the country back together, to unify. But from the start, the Prime Minister has only had a message for one side of the divide. The Conservative Party failed to act in the national interest by not planning for Brexit, and this Conservative Prime Minister has set aside the national interest once again by serving the interests of just one side of the divide. It's a double dereliction of duty. Extrapolating the view of a group within the 52% who were seriously concerned about freedom of movement and immigration, the Prime Minister has issued a loud and clear warning that control over immigration will be prioritised over jobs, the economy and living standards. Now, I'm not going to shy away from the question of immigration or to suggest that it was not a powerful factor in the referendum debate and outcome. But by clinging to the discredited promise to get immigration into the tens of thousands, the Prime Minister is raising Brexit expectations which cannot be fulfilled without seriously harming our economy and public services. Most reasonable people expect that the government should aim both for economic security and for the fair management of migration, not that it would sacrifice jobs and living standards to make arbitrary reductions in immigration. Pursuing Brexit in the partisan interest may make Tory party management easier in the short term, but as David Cameron could tell Theresa May, stray too far from the national interest and you'll be found out in the end. The Prime Minister's approach is also alienating the 48% of voters who voted to remain in the EU. They feel increasingly despondent and despairing. The government is treating them as if they voted themselves out of their own future. They did no such thing. They have a stake in the future. And no party that proceeds against our economic interest in such a divisive way deserves to govern for long. The government should be negotiating in the national interest, pulling the 52% and the 48% together, imagining and striving for a future that works for the 100%. But those who advocate frustrating the Article 50 process are making the same mistake. The Liberal Democrats hold out the false promise to the 48% of being able to frustrate the process. But what have they got to say to the 52%? Absolutely nothing. How can their stance unify the country? It can't. And Labour should not fall into the same trap. A party that can only speak to and for half a nation cannot heal a rift in our society. A party that can only speak to and for half a nation does not deserve to govern. A party that can only speak to and for half a nation cannot forge a bold, inclusive vision of the future capable of working for everyone. The same, of course, is true of UKIP's approach to Brexit. Immediate withdrawal without even bothering to negotiate a deal. The hardest of hard Brexits. Not only would this be deeply divisive, ignoring the 48% and many more besides, it would be disastrous for our economy, for jobs, and for working class communities across the country. And that brings me to the third reason why Labour should not set its sights simply on frustrating the Article 50 process. That is because to do so would mean walking away from the bigger battle that we must fight. As we stand on the brink of profound change, it is clear that there are two versions of our future which could be negotiated. The first is a future that tears us apart from our EU partners, standing outside and shut off from the European market of 500 million people who could buy our products and services, reverting to World Trade Organization rules, which the CBI has said, quotes, would do serious and lasting damage to the UK economy and those of our trading partners. A global race to the bottom, which would not only put our economy and jobs at risk, but which would abandon our shared scientific, educational and cultural endeavours with the EU, so-called hard Brexit. The second version of our future is a version where we exit the EU but build a new and strong relationship with our EU partners based on the principles of cooperation, collaboration and mutual benefit. A future which preserves our ability to trade in goods and services with our biggest market of 500 million people. A future that values joint scientific, education and cultural work with our EU partners and maintains our status as a global scientific superpower. A future that guarantees our continued cooperation in the fight against organised crime and terrorism. A future which allows the UK to retain its leading position in the world, influencing and contributing to developments across Europe and beyond. The battle between these two versions of our future is the battle of our times. It will be fought out over the next few years. Labour needs to be leading that battle. As the opposition, we need to be fighting the battle for the future of Britain. If we do not, the chance to shape the future of our country will be lost. Future generations will not forgive us for such a dereliction of duty. But accepting and respecting the referendum result is not the end of the process. It's the beginning. The referendum answered the question of what we should do, but provided no answer to how we should do it. That question was not on the ballot paper on the 23rd of June, nor was it in the Conservative Party manifesto of 2015, and it was not addressed by Theresa May before she became Prime Minister. But it is now the most pressing question Britain has faced for generations. So what does fighting for the right version of our future entail? Let me start with trade. A good deal of ink has been spilt in the last few months on the finer distinctions of the single market and the customs union, far more in recent months than in the months before the referendum. But I'm not sure how much clarity that has actually provided. So let me attempt to put Labour's position succinctly by focusing on function, not form. Put simply, Labour will push for a Brexit model which maintains and protects our ability successfully to trade goods and deliver services with and to the EU. Let me put some flesh on the bones. This means a model that ensures continued tariff-free access for UK businesses with the EU, a model that ensures any new regulatory frameworks do not add bureaucratic burdens or risk harmful divergence from the EU market, a model that protects the competitiveness of our services and manufacturing sectors, and a model that ensures that existing protections at work provided by the EU are maintained. These tests complement the aims set out by John MacDonald earlier this year and set a blueprint against which the government's endeavours can be measured. Significantly, the government has provided far less clarity about its approach. It's veered between hard or extreme Brexit and some other undefined, vaguer form of Brexit. The Prime Minister's conference speech outlined the former, a UK out of any EU rules-based system altogether, necessarily isolated and detached. When I visited Brussels shortly afterwards, it was clear that it had been received by our EU colleagues as the Prime Minister wanting to take the UK out of the single market, out of the customs union, and adopting the stance of a remote third party to the EU. Hence the description, hard Brexit. Contrast that with the tone struck by the Business Secretary, Greg Clark, when he announced Nissan's welcome investment in Sunderland. We were told that the government had given private assurances to Nissan that the UK would seek to achieve continued access to the single market without tariffs and without bureaucratic impediments. Amid these two very different versions of Brexit, we have had a range of contradictory messages from Cabinet members, as well as leaks, hints, and Boris Johnson's never-ending running commentary. Given the complexity of the issues before us and the deliberate lack of planning by the Cameron government, it is perhaps not surprising that we have this level of chaos and confusion. But it needs to end now. And that is why Labour's victory last week in securing a commitment from the government to publish a plan before invoking Article 50 was so important. You might think it's self-evident, but it was so important. During the debate last week, I set out 5 tests that the plan would have to satisfy. First, does it end uncertainty surrounding the government's position on fundamental issues such as access to the single market, the customs union, and transitional arrangements? Second, does it include sufficient detail to allow the Brexit Select Committee and other relevant parliamentary bodies to carry out their scrutiny functions effectively? Third, does it enable the Office of Budget Responsibility to do its job properly in assessing the economic impact of Brexit? Fourth, does it include sufficient detail to allow the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to be assured of their particular and specific concerns and that they're being addressed? And fifth, will it help to build a national consensus on Brexit? And I want to be clear, a late, vague plan will not do. And I've put the government on notice that if no meaningful plan emerges, Labour will seek to amend the Article 50 bill brought forward early next year. Anyone who thinks the government has been handed a blank cheque is very much mistaken. Let me now turn to freedom of movement. If Labour has the ambition to bring the 52% and the 48% together and to build a national consensus, we have to recognise that changes to the way freedom of movement rules operate in the UK have to be part of the Brexit negotiations. When I was the shadow immigration minister, I spent months visiting every region of the UK to listen to views on immigration. I know how important the issue is to many voters. I know that any party that seeks to govern needs to listen to their concerns and come up with adequate and appropriate responses. No comprehensive approach to Brexit or response to the referendum can ignore the issue of freedom of movement. as Len McCluskey recently said, and I quote, "There is no doubt that concerns about the impact of free movement played a significant part in the referendum result, particularly in working class communities. We are well past the point where this issue can be ignored. Labour needs a bold and ambitious response. The rules must change. And our new relationship with the EU will have to be one which is based on fair migration rules and the reasonable management of migration. If Brexit forces us to confront the appalling and enduring skills gap in the UK, that's a good thing. If Brexit forces us to confront low-pay exploitation, that is also a good thing. But the status quo is not an option. Labour's response must, of course, be driven by our values. As President Obama recently said, the rapidly changing nature of politics in all our countries is going to require us to manage technology and global integration in a way that makes people feel more control, that gives them more confidence in their future, but does not resort to simplistic answers or divisions of race or tribe or crude nationalism. The Labour Party and the wider Labour movement have always been at the forefront of fighting discrimination and building a fairer, more equal society. Labour recognises that without the hard work and skill of migrants, our public services, our businesses and our economy would suffer. But we've also been the party that values strong, cohesive communities. It was striking that the referendum result showed that in areas of the country with the highest levels of migration, the vote was strongly to remain. But in the areas with the highest pace of change, the vote was most strongly to leave. That tells me that British people are open and tolerant, but that they also expect change to be managed rather than simply allowing the free market to rip through their communities. This is not to pretend that arguing for changes to freedom of movement will not make a deal on the single market access harder. It will. But in the negotiations to come, it's incumbent on the government to fight for the fullest possible market access and reasonable reasonable management of migration. We should demand nothing less. But our new relationship with the EU has to go beyond an economic argument and protecting our ability to trade in goods and services, vital though they are. Underpinning everything that we've done with our European partners since the war have been shared values, British values, peace, cooperation, collaboration, the rule of law, human rights, shared security and safety. As we forge a new future outside the EU, it's vital that we reassert these values and use them to guide us through the turbulent times ahead. Labour must argue for a bold, progressive domestic policy post-Brexit. It is true, and many of us argued during the referendum campaign, that EU legislation has been the driver of progressive change in policy areas such as the environment, consumer goods and employment rights. Protecting these gains is essential, particularly since some Conservative MPs have already signalled an intention to use the Great Repeal Bill as an opportunity to water down or erode these vital rights and standards. But defending the status quo should never be the summit of Labour's ambitions. Enshrining rights in our law is important, but we should also pursue more progressive, more ambitious policies than those enshrined in EU law, not to match EU standards, but to use Labour values to go beyond them. And in doing so, to seek to address some of the underlying causes of division in our society. So let me conclude. Many of these certainties and policy assumptions we've made for more than 4 decades are now up for grabs. That is why the role of the opposition is so important right here, right now. The future of Britain is being decided, and Labour will be at the centre of it, respecting the result, fighting for a confident and outward-looking country and a cooperative, collaborative, values-led version of the future, bringing a fractured country back together, responding to Brexit in the national interest. That is Labour's task. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that great speech, Keir Starmer. My name's Tim Ross. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News, based in Westminster, reporting politics and Brexit. We've got some time now for some questions. I'm going to ask a few questions, a couple quickly first, since I've got the chance. And then we'll take a few from the media, if anyone's here from the media who wants to ask a question, and then we can open it up to anyone from the audience who would like to get involved. First of all, Keir, you talked about how divided the country is and how you want to help via the Labour Party to bring it back together. I just wondered whether you would see any merit really in offering to have cross-party talks to develop a coherent national set of priorities. Would you like to offer that sort of opportunity to Theresa May?
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because I think one of the issues that's concerned me most in the last few weeks is the rush of political parties to one side of the divide or the other. And I absolutely see it as Labour's role to represent and speak for both sides. There are others across the House who share that concern. And one of the reasons that we won last week the motion to get a plan from the government was because it was absolutely clear that a number of Tory MPs were so concerned that the government didn't have a plan that they would have voted with us. So I think there is scope for a cross-party consensus if the consensus is that hard Brexit is the wrong approach for our country.
Well, would that, in your view, involve sitting down in a room with David Davis and talking about what the priorities should be?
The problem is that David Davis and the Prime Minister have not set out what their actual plan is. I mean, this is why we're in this difficulty. We don't know which version of that future they want to negotiate. And unless and until they reduce it to writing and tell us, tell Parliament, tell you, tell the nation, then none of us can proceed. So the first task is for them to set it out. And it's profound. Two versions of the future of this country. And until last week, the government was hoping not to tell us which one they were going to negotiate. How wrong is that?
Another thought on what happens next, really. We heard yesterday from Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, that he thinks a transitional arrangement is potentially on the cards. Is that something you'd support? And how long should that transition be in years?
He's right to raise it. There are a number of strands to the negotiation, as everybody knows. The first strand is the exit negotiations, strictly the Article 50 negotiations. And then there is the equally, if not more important, negotiations which will determine our future relationship with the EU. I think most sensible observers think that it is impossible to complete both sets of negotiations within the time frame available, particularly bearing in mind that, as was pointed out last week, the time frame is probably nearer 18 months than 2 years. So I think it is helpful that the Chancellor has acknowledged that there will have to be transitional arrangements. He's right about that. It's difficult to say how long they will go on, but it is right that the government is at least acknowledging that there will be a period of transitional arrangement.
But do you think it should be open-ended, or would you put a limit on it?
There will have to be a limit on it, but the most important thing is that we get this right. And I think anybody who's looked into any of the issues will appreciate that every time you peel back one difficult problem, there are 10 lying underneath. And getting it right is absolutely crucial, and we need to allow the government time to get it right. 2 years? Well, I mean, this is pure speculation because we don't know where they're going to have got to by March 2019, and to put a year on it is just to pluck a number out of it. I mean, it depends how far they've got by March 2019. I hope they've got as far as possible. because it is in our interest to have this dealt with as quickly as possible. But until we see how far they've gone, we don't know. And that's why transparency is so important. We need to know the starting position, we need to know what's going on in the negotiations, we need to know where they've got to in March 2019.
Okay, a final quick thought from me. You were very clear that the government's ambition to get net migration down to the tens of thousands is a bad goal, really, a bad idea. You said, I think, it essentially gives people false hope that unrealistic things can be achieved from Brexit. And then you, later on in your speech, said that you wanted Labour to be committed to a reasonable level of migration. And I don't know what that reasonable level is. Can you give us a number?
I think the problem with the government's net migration target is that it is completely discredited, and everybody knows it. It's a figure that they have failed to achieve, and by simply sticking to the figure, they are destroying any public confidence in what they're doing. And this was flushed out during the referendum campaign by their own now cabinet members. So a net migration figure that is in the tens of thousands, which is hasn't been achieved and is unlikely to be achieved, is not the way forward. On the other hand, what I've made clear is that there are steps that we could take, that we should take, which would have the effect of reducing immigration. When I was the immigration minister, I was appalled going around the country when I spoke to businesses, large and small, doing different kinds of work in different regions. When I asked them all, what's the single thing that inhibits your success in the years to come, they all said the same thing: skills shortage. They couldn't get the skills they needed. So there's an appalling and enduring skills gap. And because of that, they are recruiting from the EU and beyond, because their argument is pretty straightforward. We need these skills, we can't get them. Therefore, we actively recruit to bring people here with those skills. That is a huge political failure that we need to grapple with. We need to grapple with it for the sake of everybody in this country, but it will also have the effect of reducing immigration, and that is a good thing. The same I'd say about low-pay exploitation, which again occurs across the country. So there are things that can be done that will reduce immigration, and that is a good thing.
But if it's not tens of thousands, what would reasonable management of migration?
So I think that the direction of travel needs to be downward for the reasons I've said. I don't think setting arbitrary limits is the way forward.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone for questions from the media who's around here? I can see David Hughes from here, just there.
David Hughes from the Press Association. So, Keir, you've said that the Brexit negotiations and the parliamentary process will be a battle for effectively the soul of Britain. Your key weapon in that battle would be to vote against triggering Article 50 if it does not meet your concerns. You seem to be ruling that out. Are you saying that Labour will support Article 50 even if it leads to a hard Brexit if you fail to amend the legislation?
Well, I think this has to be seen in its context. The government says it's trying to seek a consensus. And just as I'm talking to businesses, so I know David Davis and others are talking to businesses. There is no consensus for hard Brexit. So I hope, in context, that the government will not bring forward something divisive, such as hard Brexit. So the context and the tone is important. If they do, then obviously we would look at any legislation to see whether it can be amended. We don't know until the Supreme Court rules what, if any, legislation will need to be brought forth, but we've already had discussions with the bill clerks to look at possible amendments to the legislation. And the important thing is not an amendment which is not carried. The important thing is an amendment which is carried. And I think if you look across the House, it's clear that there's no consensus for hard Brexit.
Thank you. Other questions? I see Faisal there with a question.
Hello, Faisal Islam, Sky News. Sir Keir, would you accept, though, that this would potentially delay the triggering of Article 50 if you were to amend the Article 50 bill? Would that not be frustrating the process that the Prime Minister wants to enact and the speed with which?
I don't accept that for a moment. Absolutely not. I'll tell you what's delayed the bill: the appeal to the Supreme Court. We could have had the bill in Parliament 6 weeks ago if the Prime Minister had accepted the decision of the High Court and simply got on with it. So by appealing, the government has introduced a 2-month delay. If they bring forward legislation in January, of course amendments can be considered in Parliament without delaying the timetable.
Thank you. A couple more media questions we've got. At the back, gentleman at the back.
Hi, Christian Walmart. Is Brexit bad for Britain? And if so, or is there any version of Brexit that you think might be good for Britain? And if it is bad for Britain, how can you ever support it?
We had the referendum where these discussions were had, and I campaigned to stay in. We now have to face negotiations in a different world. And we have to work out how we can get the best deal for Britain. I personally think the government should go for a bespoke UK-EU arrangement that sets in place a new relationship between us and our EU partners. I think that should be cooperative, collaborative for the reasons that I set out. It has to be fought for. It has to retain the values and the benefits of the past, but it is a new relationship, and we have to be prepared to argue for that version of our future and to make sure that we do get the best out of this that works for everyone everywhere. And the point I was really trying to make in the speech is, if the mindset of any political party is simply how do we stop the process, then it is vacating the field for that important part of the exercise. And the Labour Party should not do that. We should be on the field, we should be playing, we should be fighting for a version of our future that works for everyone everywhere. And I think it's wrong not to focus on the task in hand.
Thanks. I think there was a question from a lady in the third row just here.
Julia Rampin, New Statesman. It seems that the Lib Dem stance has been doing quite well for them electorally. How does Labour avoid getting into the situation in Scotland where there's a new axis of politics and they're caught in the middle?
I think this is a time for grown-up politics where political parties think about the national interest and not short-term party interests. Any party that wants to govern this country cannot do so by speaking to only half a nation. It cannot do so, and it doesn't deserve to do so. And Labour's task is, of course, much more difficult. I accept that. Of course the position is much more nuanced, because we want something that works for the 100%, not for one side or the other. We don't want to take short-term political advantage of the fracture that has emerged, which will only fan the flames and make the division even deeper. And so I think here it is about mature reflection on what is in the national interest, rather than scrambling for a position that might help in a by-election in the next month or two.
Thanks. Question just here.
Thank you very much. Peter Walker from The Guardian. In terms of voters on the doorstep believing that Labour can reasonably reduce immigration, how does that work when over the weekend you have senior Labour figures essentially saying completely diametrically opposed thing on the issue? You have Diana Abbott saying one thing, Andy Burnham saying almost exactly the opposite. Which is the official Labour policy?
Well, I think here we need to distinguish between what sometimes has become a sort of an academic discussion about whether, in theory, the single market as it now is and the four freedoms go together, and of course they do, and the practicality of what can be negotiated over the next 2 years. And what I said today is clear that in the negotiations we have to accept that freedom of movement is there to be negotiated and that the rules will have to change. Now that is the Labour Party position so far as the negotiations are concerned. But I think actually if you extrapolate and separate out the sort of theoretical discussion from the practical discussion, you'll see that there isn't as much division as people think in the way that the Labour Party overall is putting this.
Any more burning questions from media colleagues who are around? Hands up. I can see a couple. There's a lady just there on the end, third row in.
Hi, I'm Kate Langston from the Yorkshire Post. Just kind of picking up from there, on Friday, Andy Burnham was giving a speech in Leeds when he mentioned that Europe has not been very good at providing answers to deindustrialisation in the north, that state aid rules have presented a lot of challenges when saving traditional industries, and that perhaps single market access should not be the sole focus and may not be the right thing for the north. I just wondered, do you think, is he wrong? Is there a way that we can kind of get these deals that still works for those kinds of communities?
Well, I think what Andy was reflecting is what he's hearing on the doorsteps during the course of his campaign. And I spent a lot of time as Shadow Immigration Minister out of London in different regions around the country, but particularly in the northwest and the northeast. And it's absolutely clear that immigration is a cause for concern. And we, the Labour Party, need to listen to that and to respond to that. Now, the negotiations are, in this respect, between access to the single market and some modifications to the rules on freedom of movement. That is what the negotiations will have to be about. Different people express it in different ways, and we don't know until we start what the outcome will be. But I think what's important about what I've said today is that from the Labour Party's point of view, there's an acknowledgement that this is an issue that cannot be ignored, will have to be part of the negotiations, and that the government should seek both good access to the single market and reasonable management of migration. And it shouldn't shy away from that task. It's got to aim high.
Great, thanks very much. So we've got, I think, one last from Joe there, one last media question, and then we'll open it up. So anyone who wants to get involved at all, we've got about another 15 minutes left. And we'll take the next questions in groups of two. But Joe, quickly.
Thanks very much. Joe Waltz, The Independent. Keir, one of the issues that's been dividing the government is whether foreign students, should be included in net migration figures. I'm just wondering what Labour's approach is. Do you think foreign students should be removed from net migration figures?
This obviously is not my brief, but I'll give you from my work on immigration, I think keeping students in the numbers it doesn't make very much sense, because they're here as students from other countries who are studying in our country for a period of time, after which they leave. And I think it would be more helpful if we were to have a sensible immigration plan and policy to focus on other areas. I didn't meet many people in my 4 months going around the country talking about immigration who said the one thing we must do is reduce the number of students who want to come to our country to study and contribute. Almost nobody said that to me. So that is clearly not the major cause, because of course where there are bogus courses, that's got to be dealt with. I completely accept that. But I didn't hear many people saying this is where you really need to press down. This is what we want to stop. I think most people, when they understood they were in the figures, said, well, I'm surprised because I wouldn't myself be thinking of students as in the same way as people who are coming to settle on a permanent basis in the country.
Thanks very much. Now, who else would like to ask? Oh, lots of hands, excellent. Well, as I say, we'll go for two at a time. So, first of all, gentleman here in the front row, he was sharpest off the block, I think. And ask your question, we'll go somewhere else.
Hi, good morning, afternoon. It's Tim Middleton from Islington South. Can you categorically, are you categorically opposed to a second referendum?
Okay, great question. We'll hold that thought. And I haven't asked anyone down that way yet. Another front row question. Gentleman on the end just here, please.
Thank you. Hi, Keir. Andy Thornley from the British Insurance Brokers Association. Do you feel the language around hard and soft Brexit, presenting it as a binary choice, is damaging to forming some sort of position on this and presenting that to the EU?
I'll deal with both. I mean, the Labour Party is not calling for a second referendum. I think any calls for a second referendum are simply being interpreted as a call to rerun the referendum that we've got, and that is obviously not consistent with accepting and respecting the outcome. So far as the language is concerned, one of the reasons in my speech I tried to spell out function, not form, is because I think that whether it's on the single market, the customs union, or some aspects of hard or soft Brexit, we're in danger of using shorthand and missing the point. What most businesses are saying to me is not some clever theory about the single market or customs union. They're saying we want to trade without tariffs and encumbrances. We're very concerned about regulatory regimes, and if there are separate regulatory regimes, we're concerned that there shouldn't be one for the EU and one for the UK that are different and that might diverge. So I think actually stripping it down into the component parts, what is it you actually want to see in the deal, is actually much more useful than tags and descriptions, which are I don't think are going to be helpful for very much longer. So actually, I think the preference, what I did in the speech, was to say this is what we need to achieve. How we achieve it is what's got to be the process over the next 2 years.
Thanks very much. There's a question in the very far corner, over that side. Thank you.
Hi, Keir. Barry Pamparaja from Chelsea and Fulham. It's a very quick question. As we are here in the City of London, what is your view on whether London should get a separate deal, particularly in relation to the services sector?
Thanks very much. And another one just here in the middle, yep. Thanks.
Chairman, my name is Paul Adamson. So, Keir, if I understand you correctly, you were saying a key, if not the key issue in the referendum campaign was indeed free movement of people. This morning, the European Commission in Brussels has produced proposals about access, laying down rules and principles for the access to benefits across the European Union. This suggests maybe that there's a Europe-wide debate about to start about free movement in the broader sense, which suggests in turn that maybe there's scope for a deal on free movement with the UK and EU27. If that were to be the case, why leave the European Union at all?
Let me do it. I mean, I think the services sector in London is a real cause for concern, and it is really important the government seeks a deal that works for services of all sorts in London. And I know that the Mayor has got that uppermost in his mind. I've never seen that as a London-specific issue, because actually, although there are very, very strong service sectors in London, of course, there are service sectors across the country as a whole, and increasingly it's impossible to separate services and manufacturing, for example, because often the two go together. But I absolutely agree that the government must seek a deal that ensures that our service sector remains as competitive as it is now, because it is so important to our economy. But that's whether it's in London or anywhere else. As for developments in Europe, I mean, I think this is a really important point, because obviously we've seen profound change in this country in 2016. But what we're also seeing is the potential for change across Europe in the next few coming years, with really significant elections coming up. And I think some of the pressures and influences in the UK are not isolated to the UK, and that that may be or will be the context in which the negotiations will take place. Now, we haven't got to the starting line yet. The 2 years will be an important period in the history of Europe, but I do think that this is the time for grown-up discussions across Europe about some of these key issues, because actually the best outcome for the UK is also the best outcome for our EU partners, and that's why it's very important that we are in a dialogue with them the whole time. It's also the reason why it's so important for the government to set the right tone going into the negotiations. I'm not sure it's got that right recently.
Thanks. Time for a couple more. Yep, there's a question just on this far side here. 2 in, about 3 rows back. Yep, thanks.
Hi, Sakir, this is a Labour Party member here. In your speech, you said that you wanted tariff-free access to Europe after we leave, but you also said at the same time that the status quo on immigration cannot continue any longer. But by saying that you want tariff-free access to the European Union, are you now dismissing any sorts of controls on freedom of movement? And what kind of message does that send to 7 out of 10 Labour constituencies that voted leave, and people among myself and the Labour Party that voted leave in 2020 in our electoral prospects?
And there's a question, gentleman at the back.
Shadow Minister, call it collective responsibility or call it basic teamwork, but it seems to me that you've got a major problem at the moment within the Shadow Cabinet, and particularly with regard to Jeremy Corbyn's control over his MPs. Do you see any evidence, working with the Shadow Cabinet, working with the leader, that he is managing to exert sufficient control over his own MPs so that the country will give you the opportunity to have an influence in any event? Do you see that the country see the Labour Party as a credible, united group that can deliver things which their supporters, as you've pointed out already, so desperately need? Do you see yourselves as a united group working as a team now? Do you see evidence of that building within the Labour Party? Because that's what your supporters are looking to hear from you today.
Thanks.
Can I deal with the tariff-free access point first?
You do have to do the other one too.
We're entering the negotiations. It is quite right that we should argue for tariff-free access to the single market and adjustments to freedom of movement. And I don't think that goes contrary to the vote. I've been to factories across the country. I was in a factory in Wales just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And nobody there, in areas where predominantly they voted to leave, was voting that their local factory should struggle because of tariffs that they will have to pay in the future that they're not paying now. Nobody says I voted out in order to ensure that my factory would be less productive and I might lose my job. On the contrary, their message is to the government, you've got to achieve both. That is where you go. Now, this is where getting hung up on single market membership or access is unhelpful, and we should say what we mean, and that is tariff-free access. I have to say, although most people go to tariffs as the most important issue, in fact it isn't. And most businesses are saying to me that uppermost in their mind is the regulatory regimes that are at risk if there isn't similarity between what may happen after the negotiations with what is happening now. So I think these are achievable goals, actually, achievable goals. And I'm absolutely sure the government should be going for the best possible deal, and we need to ensure they are and not let them start in a position of secondary importance. Let me then deal with the Labour Party, and I just want to put this in context, because we have MPs who represent heavily Remain voting areas, and we have MPs who represent heavily Leave voting areas. That is the makeup of the Labour Party. That is actually nothing to do with the leader of the Labour Party, and it's certainly not a left-right split. It is a fact of life when you have a party that is capable of reaching both sides. Now, of course, that makes life more difficult in some respects. I accept that. But it's also a huge strength. If you want a party that is capable of bringing the country back together, you need that. You need it. Therefore, I think we need to see this in its historical context. I'd also say this, that since I've been doing the Brexit brief, the Labour Party has been a magnet for businesses, for academics, for groups who are concerned about Brexit, they've been coming to our door to say, can we work with you to make sure you are arguing the case that we need made for our future? And that is what led me to deliver the speech in the way I did not so long ago. So, I'm not going to pretend that there isn't a challenge ahead. I'm not going to pretend that the Labour Party hasn't got a huge task to do. But I honestly do think this needs to be seen in its proper context. It is good that the Labour Party is able to reach both sides of an increasingly bitter divide, and we must make sure the country comes back together. None of us are enjoying living with this divide. If you travel across the UK, it is unpleasant to have this level of division and hatred, and it breaks out. There's been a hate crime increase, even in parts of London. It breaks out, and we've got to do what we can to heal it. And actually, what may at first seem like a difficulty for the Labour Party is, on analysis, a strength.
Thanks very much. We are pretty much out of time, but huge thanks to Keir Starmer for coming and talking and for taking so many questions from members of the audience. We will be, all of us, I'm sure, paying quite close attention to what you do and what the government does during the months ahead as the country, in your words, seeks to grapple with the battle of our times. Thanks very much to Keir Starmer.